In like 10 years, 12 years time, the US dollar will be like wallpaper.
We are on the precipice of a major economic financial collapse. I mean, what we've just experienced, I mean, that's just the opening act. I mean, the real collapse is coming.
One stimulus package will lead to the next one and to more money printing. And so in 5 to 10 years' time, the real crisis will break out when the whole system collapses. That will be the end.
Eventually, this dollar's going to quit working, and then everybody's going to know what poverty is all about.
Our politicians need to understand why the country is in this shape. It's because of them. It's because of the Federal Reserve and their policies, their regulations that have distorted the free market and that have created this mess. And that if they don't stop doing what they're doing, there's going to be no turning back.
As the fiscal deficit goes up, the interest payments on the government debt also go up. They are now around $400 billion annually. I would think that they'll be around $1 trillion in 5 to 7 years' time.
Can you talk to us about the deficit? Are you worried? Should this be a near-term priority?
Everybody ought to be worried about the deficit. It's a big deficit, but the time will come to deal with it.
And so then the government goes bust, but before it does that, it will inflate its way out, or try to inflate its way out. And that won't work. So the next step will be to go to war. The whole thing will collapse.
Since the release of our first documentary, Hyperinflation Nation, 5 months ago, gold prices have increased from $925 per ounce to over $1,150 per ounce, while silver has increased from $14 per ounce to over $18 per ounce. The rise in the price of gold and silver is a result of the major monetary inflation being created by the Federal Reserve, which has held interest rates at 0% for almost a full year. Under the false pretenses of trying to get our phony economy to recover, the Federal Reserve is giving trillions of dollars away for free to bankers on Wall Street at the expense of the American middle class, who will soon see the purchasing power of their savings disappear. The false strength of our phony economy has become dependent on easy money and cheap credit from the Federal Reserve. The longer the Federal Reserve waits to raise interest rates, the greater the chances that our economy will overdose on excess liquidity. There will be two social classes of Americans in the future: those who sell their US dollars today and buy gold and silver, and those who buy into the false hope of an economic recovery.
It's sort of like trying to get somebody off drugs. What you're talking about is you don't want the withdrawal symptoms, and I admit there will be withdrawal symptoms. But keeping them on the drug, which is easy money, easy spending, and huge deficits and all that, that'll kill the patient. And the patient, for me, is the dollar, and we're going to be on the verge of killing the patient. And when you see gold up at $1,100 an ounce, that's a little bit of a warning sign.
If we keep interest rates artificially low, we're going to destroy the currency. We're going to be talking about, gold not just going up, to $25 in a day, but $50, $100 in a day, $1,000 in a day.
The U.S. national debt just surpassed $12 trillion, and the U.S. government itself is estimating a $9 trillion budget deficit over the next 10 years. If the U.S. government was a publicly traded company, it would be bankrupt and its stock price would be zero. It's only a matter of time before the decline in the US dollar we are seeing today becomes a rout and the dollar returns to its intrinsic value of zero.
From what I read and from what I see, there's no intention whatsoever of US policymakers to do anything to stabilize the dollar. They'll continue to print money, and I think long term, my end value for the dollar is zero.
While they see it as a remote possibility, their big concern for the moment is the potential for a disorderly decline in the dollar, which they describe it as a momentum-led sell-off where the market would become untethered from fundamentals. In that event, officials say they have contingency plans of what they would say and do. They decline to specify what those plans would be. They insist those plans are not a matter of heightened concern, just prudent preparation, like a plan for the invasion of a country that is unlikely to invade. You never expect to need it, but it would be foolish not to have it in place.
There is no point for the government to make a contingency plan for when the dollar collapses, because at that point it will be too late. They should be acting to restore confidence in the dollar now, before it collapses. The Federal Reserve is nothing more than a counterfeiting operation. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, 95 cents of every dollar saved by Americans has been stolen. Some might consider the Federal Reserve to be unconstitutional and this dilution of savings to be a crime. Yet there is still no widespread outrage about it.
This is not new. This is historic. The king in the old days always had control of the money. They did it in different ways. They clipped coins, diluted the metal, printed money. Today, it's really sophisticated. It's done secretly with a computer, and that's why it's made it so much more dangerous than ever before.
So who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion, and you don't know who got the money?
The loans go to the central banks, and they then put them out to their institutions to try to bring down short-term interest rates in dollar markets around the world.
Well, look at the next page. The very next page has the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate, which shows a 20% increase in the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate at exactly the same time that you were handing out $500 billion to foreigners. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Yes.
Bernanke is not doing a good job. He's doing a horrific job. He's doing, about as bad a job as you could do. I mean, maybe it's possible there's somebody who could do a worse job. I mean, I don't know for sure, but there might be.
Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke recently said that the U.S. should cut down on its budget deficit in order to reduce global imbalances. This is hypocritical, as it's Bernanke who is allowing the U.S. to have such huge budget deficits by monetizing our government spending. Bernanke is the only person with the power to put a stop to this madness, but in his campaign to get reappointed, he most likely promised everyone in Washington that he would continue monetizing their spending into the future.
In 10 years' time, in my opinion, about 50% of tax revenues will be used to just cover the interest payments on the government debt, and that is unsustainable. Then you really are forced to print money.
Have you ever looked around your house to see where the products inside of it were made? Most likely 90% of them were made in China. How could the US have the biggest economy in the world if so few of what we own is made here? The US's biggest export is inflation. Because of the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, we can just print the money to purchase the goods we consume. However, the world is now looking to move away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency.
This should be front story on the evening news every night. I mean, this is a big thing. Our credit card is about to be taken away. I mean, the reason that this country has been able to survive all these years is because we can print money instead of making stuff.
It is the US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency and the fact that foreign nations are forced to trade oil and other commodities in US dollars that has kept the US economy propped up until now. Recent reports indicate that Saudi states are meeting with countries like China and Japan in order to end dollar-based oil transactions and begin transacting oil using a new basket of currencies. To further their move away from the US dollar, China's Ministry of Finance recently announced plans to sell billions worth of 2-year, 3-year, and 5-year yuan-denominated bonds in Hong Kong. Shockingly, over the past 3 months, foreign central banks have put 63% of their new cash purchases into euros and yen, and not into the US dollar. The US dollar still accounts for 62% of the world's foreign currency reserves at foreign central banks. But for how long? India just purchased 200 metric tons of gold from the IMF for $6.7 billion in order to diversify their reserves away from the US dollar. How low will the US dollar fall, and how high will gold rise when more central banks diversify out of dollars and into gold? Despite China boosting its gold reserves by 76% since 2003, gold still only accounts for 1.5% of China's foreign currency reserves. Yet, China still owns $1.6 trillion in US dollar reserves. Most telling of all, China is now encouraging their citizens to invest in silver and will be offering silver for sale at banks in China.
Tuesday's first ever investment opportunity for silver bullion. The bars are available in 500 grams, 1 kilogram, 2 kilograms and 5 kilograms with a purity of 99.9%. Figures show that gold was 50 times more expensive than silver in 2007, but now that figure has reached over 70 times, the highest in the past 5 years. Analysts say that silver has been undervalued in recent years. They add that the metal is a wise investment for individual investors and could be a good way to cash in.
We are the first to offer silver bullion as an investment opportunity. The price for the first batch of the bullion is set very low, close to the cost of the raw material. The investment threshold is not high, and it is more suitable for the general public. Silver is much cheaper than gold.
While the U.S. saw positive GDP growth last quarter, and Bernanke called the recession very likely over, consumer spending now accounts for 71% of our GDP compared to the long-term average of 65%. This means our economy is actually weakening underneath the surface. In order for our economy to truly recover, we need to switch from being a nation of consumers to a nation of producers. But in order for the U.S. to once again begin producing goods to export to the rest of the world, we need Americans to increase savings. In late 2008, early 2009, after the U.S. financial markets collapsed, the first instinct of Americans was to start saving. While initially the American savings rate tripled to a high in May of 6.2%, after the government's artificial stimulus took effect, the savings rate plummeted in half back down to 3%. The free market was trying desperately to get our economy headed in the right direction, but the government destroyed any progress that was made. 42% of the phony GDP growth we saw last quarter came from the government's destructive Cash for Clunkers program.
And so here's a car that people own that they were driving without any payments. They didn't have any car loans on these clunkers. They owned them. Let's destroy that. Let's give you $4,500 to pour acid on the engine so it'll never work. And then we'll pay money to scrap it and all that. Who knows what it costs to actually get rid of each of these working cars. And let's encourage you to go buy a brand new car that you can't afford. And you're going to go into debt to do it. So now, every month, you have to make a car payment that you didn't have before. This is great. This is really how to get out of a recession, right? It's like we got shot in the arm, and so the solution is, well, let's shoot ourselves in the foot, too.
Cash for Clunkers was a Chinese program because they would not take our US dollars for their exports. We had to send them a bunch of metal and steel for them to give any type of credit to the US. A lot of people don't realize that. That was a brainchild of the Chinese embassy, not the US.
Cash for Clunkers isn't the government's only wasteful new program. They recently extended the home buyer's tax rebate, which credits a first-time home buyer, or somebody who hasn't owned a home in 3 years, $8,000 for buying a house. They are also giving out $6,500 to those who lived in their prior home for 5 years or more and now wish to buy a new home. Not only that, but if you can't afford to pay your mortgage, the government is now going to allow you to rent your home from Fannie Mae at a reduced rate in a new Deed for Lease program. The home buyer's tax rebate and Deed for Lease programs are designed to create artificial demand for houses and keep housing inventory off of the market. This is creating the false signal that the real estate market has bottomed and now is a good time to buy real estate. Unfortunately, Americans who buy real estate at this time will get slaughtered. The average U.S. home currently costs 20,000 ounces of silver. The last time the Federal Reserve rapidly increased its money supply back in the 1970s, we saw home prices fall from 20,000 ounces of silver down to a low of 2,000 ounces of silver. The bottom line is, if you invest in silver today instead of real estate, you might be able to afford a house 10 times nicer in 5 to 10 years. Most Americans today believe dollars are a safe asset because it has a number on it that always stays the same, while gold and silver's nominal prices can sometimes be very volatile. What's going to happen to the dollar when Americans wake up and realize it is actually the riskiest asset of all? Americans have come to accept inflation as being normal. They've learned from their parents that it was only 60 years ago when it cost 5 cents for a glass bottle of Coke, 5 cents for a pack of baseball cards, 5 cents for a Hershey chocolate bar, 15 cents for a burger at McDonald's, 16 cents for Kellogg's cornflakes, and 50 cents for a movie ticket. But they see nothing wrong with this because inflation occurred over a long period of time. It took 25 years for our national debt to double from $257 billion in 1950 to over $533 billion in 1975. Most recently, our national debt has more than doubled from $5.8 trillion in 2001 to its current level of over $12 trillion in just 8 years. Our national debt is now growing 3 times faster than it did decades ago, which means we should expect a very minimum of 3 times faster inflation. Therefore, if it took 60 years for a movie ticket price to rise from 50 cents to $7.50, it will most certainly rise to at least $112.50 within the next 20 years. And that's a best case scenario. Americans may not see much price inflation today because major U.S. banks are currently hoarding $860 billion in excess reserves. Congress passed legislation in late 2008 allowing the Federal Reserve to pay interest on the reserves banks keep parked at the Fed. However, as some of these banks begin to make loans, price inflation will increase to a level that is higher than the interest they collect. This will force the other banks to also make loans, and we will see a huge flood of dollars entering the system all at once.
I heard you talk about you use pricing as a reference, and that purely printing more money doesn't cause inflation, which was really new news to me. And I wonder if you tell me what you think causes inflation.
Well, let's be clear what's going on. The Federal Reserve is not putting money out into the economy. What we're doing is we're creating bank reserves. That's money that the banks hold with the Fed. So it's just sitting there idly. It's not chasing any goods. Okay? So as long as those bank reserves are sitting idly, broader measures of money that measure the circulation of money.
But it won't sit there idly forever. The purpose of it is not to sit there idly forever. And,
right.
And while there may be a time lapse, certainly, unless that money gets sucked back in, and out of circulation, it's going to cause inflation. There's no denying it.
If it's not sucked back in, but as I was describing, we have ways of sucking it back in.
How?
Well, one way to do it is by raising the interest rate we pay on those reserves, which induces banks to keep the money with us instead of lending it out or circulating it through the economy.
To counteract the inflation of the 1970s, the Federal Reserve needed to raise interest rates in 1980 to 21.5%. With interest rates currently being held at an artificially low level of 0% for an extended period of time, artificially high interest rates of 21.5% or more will once again be needed to counteract the damage being done today. In 2009, the U.S. government spent $383 billion on interest payments to holders of our national debt. Considering that most of our national debt is now made up of short-term T-bills, if we see the Federal Reserve raise interest rates to 21.5%, our interest payments could grow to over $2.58 trillion when our entire government tax receipts in 2009 were only $2.185 trillion. It will be impossible for Obama to meet his budget projection and cut the deficit in half from $1.6 trillion in 2009 to $761 billion in 2012. Most likely by 2012, we will be looking at $3 or $4 trillion budget deficits or more. Therefore, The trend of accelerating national debt growth is likely to continue, and the next doubling of our debt could actually occur in 4 years, which means we could see our $112 movie ticket within the next 5 to 10 years. But that's only if the Chinese are dumb enough to keep lending us their money. Most likely, the Chinese will stop lending us their money and just allow the dollar to collapse.
As they devalue the dollar and the currencies around the world are worth more, they're going to come in here and buy this country up for dimes on the dollar. So all you people out there, you know who the man you're going to be working for? Well, the man's going to be from China. They're going to be from countries with money.
All Americans who ride in taxi cabs in major U.S. cities have probably heard dozens of stories from immigrants telling their tales of how they escaped their homeland in order to get to America. In the future, taxi cab drivers in Asian countries will be talking about how they escaped America in order to get there. There are now thousands of young Americans who are moving to China for jobs.
You go to school, you get good grades, you work for 30 years, and then you retire. That system is a fraud, it's an illusion, and it hasn't even been tested. It's been one big experiment.
We have an education system here in America where high schools teach students nothing other than the need to get deeply into debt to obtain a college degree that is worthless because everyone else has one.
How about getting out of college and being, what, $30, $40, $50, $60,000 in debt? Look, we know Ivy League graduates at a law school that can't find jobs. You think they're going to be angry?
Our nation's most prestigious Ivy League schools are teaching students delusive economic principles. Look what students at Harvard are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to learn from their professors.
On healthcare costs, Bob is absolutely right that healthcare spending as a percent of GDP has been rising, and it's largely rising because of technological advance. My own forecast is that will continue, and that should continue. So actually, I'm nervous about prospects to rein in healthcare costs that are too aggressive, because I think that healthcare advances have been a modern form of progress.
Harvard is brainwashing students with absolute nonsense. Healthcare costs are not rising due to technological advances. They are rising due to government involvement.
You look at the areas where government is not involved. I mean, government's not involved in personal computers. They're not involved in cell phones. Yet the prices are falling. If the government was involved, the prices wouldn't be falling. I mean, they can easily rationalize it by saying, well, of course computer prices are going up. Look how much more sophisticated they are. Look how much more powerful they are. How could the prices not go up? They make the same arguments with education or health insurance. Well, they say health insurance, well, it's so much more complicated. We have so much better procedures. If there was no government involved, I'm sure healthcare costs would be falling. Just like other costs are falling in the economy, because the free market is the best mechanism for driving costs down.
If you look at braces, or you look at eye surgery, or you look at breast enhancements, these prices were really high when the technology first came out. But just like other electronics, like plasma TVs or cell phones, this stuff has all contracted. The prices have decreased. Healthcare decreases in prices everywhere the government isn't.
Not only is inflation gravitating towards the area of our economy in which the government is involved in the most, but it is also beginning to gravitate towards the goods that Americans need the most, and there is nothing that Americans need more than food and agricultural products.
I'm big on agricultural commodities. People need to eat. It's not an optional thing. It's not like, you know what, I really want to buy an ounce of gold, but some people can't afford it. But people can say, I really want to eat, but I really can't afford it. People are going to eat. They're going to acquire food. So that's why, with complete assurity, I know, it might sound arrogant, but I know that the prices of basic commodities and food is going to go up, and going to go way up.
Before, if you take $1, you could give your kid $1 and they're able to buy, cookie, a bag of chips, and maybe a fruit punch. That's pretty good for $1. Right now, you could get a fruit punch. And this was only 2 years ago. A fruit punch that we sell at 35 cents is now 69 cents. That's double. That's hyperinflated. And people don't realize it because it's such at a low level. All the basic things, that's candies, foods, the real small 25-cent things, those are all doubled in price already. Why isn't people realizing that? Look at what happened to the price of rice. As a Korean, I don't shop for rice, but a lot of ladies do. They didn't really realize why that bag of rice from $5 went to $19. Brazil said we're not going to take no more dollars for rice. We'd rather eat it on our own because our economy is growing. And from just Brazil stopping their exports to the U.S., bags of rice went from $5 to $15 overnight.
Already, I said I was trying to buy a young coconut. They were $1.19 4 months ago. I went to buy a young coconut. It was $1.69. 40-50% inflation in months. People on the ground all over America are noticing the price of bread and eggs and things going up. So there's inflation in what's important, which is food. So if that's the case, it'd be better to switch those dollars for food right now than not to do so.
We're going to see, seriously, victory gardens popping up all over LA and Southern California. Especially Southern California, because you know what? Next year, it's going to be horrible for foods. I mean, horrible in a sense that it's going to be so inflated. Because, California this year, the fall harvest was wiped out. There's nothing in California. Where's the avocados? Where's the apples? Where's the pears? There's none.
The inventories of agricultural products are the lowest they've been in decades. Not years, Bernie, but in decades. And we're going to have more problems. There are going to be periods when people cannot get food at any price. And this has not happened in our lifetimes.
Last year, the farmers couldn't get loans for fertilizers. They had to shut down counties and counties and counties because of the water issue. There's colony collapse disorder where there's no bees in California. They've been having to import bees from Arizona, and that's not even covering even 10% of the pollination. So we're going to see a huge food shortage come next year in California. You're going to see hyperinflation big time. Look at cranberries. They used to have Ocean Spray cranberry juice. Read the label. It's not real cranberries anymore. They can't afford real cranberries to make Ocean Spray. Remember, Ocean Spray was famous for using real cranberries. Not anymore.
With food and agriculture prices starting to go through the roof, even working class Americans are becoming dependent on food stamps.
If you really want to know how this downturn is affecting people, you look at food stamp use. And right now, we're running 43% of people who are on food stamps have a job.
What is going to happen when Americans receive their food stamps, but the shelves at the grocery stores that accept them are empty? What's going to happen when senior citizens receive their Social Security checks, but they aren't worth enough to pay for the gas needed to drive to the bank and cash them?
Civil unrest will happen in this country because of hyperinflation. Now, what's going to happen to the entitlements? These entitlements are exploding in our faces. They're bankrupting Europe. They're bankrupting the United States. So Americans will either be broke, dumb, ignorant, and begging for more entitlements, or Americans will watch documentaries like these and educate themselves. And when this wall finally tears down, when this whole system collapses and explodes into our faces over the coming years and months, Americans have the opportunity to tear down the entitlements, to go back to an ownership and individual society where you work hard, you keep what you make, and you take care of your family. And when you can't take care of yourself, you look to family, not the government.
The National Inflation Association is dedicated to helping Americans prepare for and prosper during hyperinflation. NIA will soon be releasing the world's first ever comprehensive, unbiased review of all of the major online sellers of gold and silver bullion. If you would like to receive this special upcoming report along with NIA's latest articles and updates about hyperinflation and the collapsing US dollar, sign up today for the free NIA newsletter at inflation.us. Also be sure to check out NIA's newest feature on inflation.us called NIA Answers, where you can submit to NIA your questions about inflation and the economy and search through the database of previously answered questions.
Just a year ago, 29 million Americans were on food stamps. Today, it's 36 million Americans. That's just over 1 in 10.
China has already surpassed us in being the largest car buyers in the world.
That's not real recovery. That's borrowing money from the future generations and spending it now and then saying we're in real recovery. So that's insanity.